They all laughed when she walked toward the stage, not loudly, not cruelly, but with the kind of dismissive amusement people reserve for someone stepping far outside their place. A murmur rolled through the crowd, soft and knowing like they were. All in on a joke. After all, she was not dressed for the spotlight. She wore a plain navy cardigan, a gray skirt that hung just below her knees, and shoes that looked more practical than elegant. No designer touches, no shimmer, no sense of belonging in the prestigious concert hall where legends were made and worshipped. Hadley kept her eyes down as she moved between the velvet-covered chairs, was careful not to brush against any of the elegantly dressed patrons. Her blonde hair was pulled into a simple ponytail, and her hands, though clean, carried the soft calluses of someone used to work that went unseen. She was part of the background, an assistant, a cleaner, quiet presence people passed by without ever really seeing. But tonight, all of that was about to change. It had started just an hour earlier, when the golden chandeliers above the marble floor bathed the grand hall in warm light. Crystal glasses clinked gently. Laughter mingled with the sound of a string quartet in the background. Guests in tailored suits and gowns gathered in small circles, discussing art, legacy, and the brilliance of the man everyone had come to see, Pierce Whitmore. The master of the piano, he was the kind of man who made silence fall the moment he entered a room. 52. Pierce had built a career on technical perfection and dramatic flair. His silver hair was always combed back smoothly, his custom tuxedos always flawless, and his name always mentioned with reverence in classical music circles. Tonight his return to the hall was more than just a performance, it was an event, and in the middle of that elegance, Hadley stood invisible, placing water on tables, checking program placements, ensuring everything looked perfect. She had worked at this hall for almost 4 years, always behind the scenes. No one knew her story. No one ever asked. As the guests were ushered to their seats, Pierce adjusted his silk body and looked out at the audience with quiet satisfaction. Everything was exactly how he liked it, polished, controlled, admiring. He noticed Hadley as she leaned over the grand piano, gently wiping away a fingerprint from its gleaming surface. She moved carefully, like the instrument meant something more than just an object to clean. Her fingers hovered for a second longer than necessary. There was something in her eyes, not reverence, but understanding. "Careful there, Pierce," said, his voice low but audible as he stepped closer. "That piano is worth more than most people's homes." Hadley straightened immediately, startled. "Yes, sir. I am always careful." He gave her a tight, amused smile and walked away without another word. That moment should have ended. There just another quiet dismissal in a lifetime of being unseen. But it didn't. The music began. Chopin's Ballade. No. One flowed through the room, and Pierce played with practiced brilliance. His fingers moved like lightning over the keys. Every note was clean, every phrase exact. The crowd was enthralled. His performance had no flaw, except perhaps one. It lacked soul. Hadley stood at the very back, behind a pillar, her eyes closed, listening not just with her ears, but with her entire being. She knew this piece, not from watching YouTube videos or hearing it at work. She had studied it once, long ago, when her world was very different. When her father would sit beside her on an old upright piano in their modest apartment and teach her what each phrase meant, not just technically, but emotionally. She had not touched a real piano in years, but the music lived in her. And when Pierce ended the piece to a round of applause, he looked back once again and saw Hadley standing there, watching, feeling, breathing with the music. It irritated. Hell could someone like her, someone without training, pedigree, or presence, dare to stand there with such connection in her face? What did she think she understood? And that is when it happened. The challenge, the joke, the moment that changed everything. But for now, the only thing that had changed was this. For the first time in her life, Hadley was about to be seen. The hall settled again after the applause, a low hum of conversation fading as Pierce returned to center stage. He soaked in the admiration, the familiar comfort of being the center of attention. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman near the back wall, the one who had no right to look so moved, one whose presence had begun to irritate him. In a way he could not fully explain, Pierce Whitmore was a man who believed in order. He believed that talent belonged to those who earned it through years of study, prestigious conservatories, and recognition from the right circles. He had sacrificed, he had studied, and he had mastered every technique known to the classical world. People like Hadley, quiet, modest, untrained, We're there to clean the floors and set the stage. It's not to feel the music like performers did. Not to belong. And yet there she was, still, as the lights dimmed again and the next piece began. He could feel her gaze, could imagine her breathing in every note. It unsettled him. Hadley, unaware of the storm building inside Pierce, kept to her place in the shadows, but her mind was anything but still. As he began Chopin's Etude Op. 10, no, 4 fast, fierce and nearly impossible to play, she followed every passage. Her hands moved slightly in the air, her fingers mirroring the technique she had studied from books borrowed long ago. She could feel the tension in her spine with each dramatic shift, could hear her father's voice reminding her, "Let the keys guide your hands. Trust the sound. Tell the story." That voice lived in her even now, years after he was gone. Had carried her through quiet nights and long days. It had whispered through every moment she had passed this piano, but never dared touch it. And now it gave her something else. Strength. Pierce ended the etude with a flourish, his fingers lifting gracefully, the final chord hanging in the air like smoke. Thunderous applause followed, the kind he had come to expect. But it rang a little hollow this time, because the first thing he saw when he looked up was Hadley, still there, still watching, still moved. He stood from the bench slowly, keeping his expression composed. But inside, something sharp twisted. He could not explain why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the way she seemed to understand the music, not with technique, but with truth. She looked like she belonged, and that offended him. So he did something he would later regret. He turned to the audience and raised his voice just enough. "To carry, ladies and gentlemen," he said with an easy smile. "Before we move on, I have a bit of unexpected inspiration." He turned and gestured toward the back. "We have among us tonight someone who seems deeply connected to the music." Murmurs spread through the hall as heads turned. Hadley froze. "You there?" he said, pointing directly at her. "Yes, you, the young lady in the gray skirt. You look as though you know these pieces intimately. Tell me, do you play?" The question cut through the silence. Hadley's heart began to pound. Every face in the audience was now turned toward her. She swallowed, suddenly aware of her hands, her shoes, the plainness of her clothes. I used to," she answered quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Used to," Pierce repeated with a chuckle. "Well, surely someone who listens so intently would not mind sharing a bit of their talent with our esteemed guests." Polite laughter bubbled up from the front rows. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, eager to see the awkwardness unfold. Hadley took a step back. I really should not. I am just staff." "I am not nonsense," Pierce cut in smoothly, gesturing toward the piano. "Music is for everyone, is it not? And what better way to honor that than to give someone like you a chance to share what you clearly love so deeply?" His tone was kind, but the trap was unmistakable. He was setting her up to stumble, to fumble, to be put back in her place. In front of everyone, Hadley could feel her breath catch. Every instinct told her to walk away, to say no. But then, somewhere deep in her memory, her father's voice rose up again. "Sometimes life hands you a key. All you have to do is turn it." She realized this was her moment. Not given, forced, but still a moment. So she stepped forward, and the hall fell into a hush. The sound of her footsteps on the polished marble echoed louder than expected. Each step felt impossibly long, as if the weight of 100 judgments pressed down on her shoulders. The audience had gone completely still. Even those who had been whispering behind fans or sipping their champagne now sat frozen, watching the woman who was never meant to leave the shadows walk toward the center of the stage. Pierce stood beside the grand piano, a smug smile curling at the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man presenting a magic trick, except he was not expecting awe. He was expecting failure, something mildly embarrassing, just enough to get a laugh and remind everyone that true artistry belonged to people like him, not her. As Hadley approached, he extended a hand in mock chivalry, gesturing to the piano bench like a game show host. "Tell me," he said, loud enough for the audience to hear, "what shall we expect tonight? Perhaps a bit of Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star? Or maybe Chopsticks? I am told that is quite popular with beginners." Laughter rippled through the Hollandaise in some corners, delighted in others. Hadley's face flushed, but she did not flinch. She stood beside the piano and ran her fingers lightly over the lid. It was beautiful. She had cleaned it 100 times, but had never touched its keys with intent. Not like this. Pierce stepped back with theatrical grace, folding his arms. "Well, Let us not keep the patrons waiting." Hadley took a deep breath and spoke not to him, but to the room. "I was thinking," she said softly, "of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." The room froze. Every laugh died mid-breath. Pierce blinked. The smile did not leave his face, but something in it shifted like the mask had cracked. "Ballade No. 1, he repeated, now uncertain if he had heard her correctly, that is. "Ambitious." "I know," Hadley replied, and then, without waiting for his approval, she sat down. The bench was cold beneath her, the keys gleaming in the soft stage light. She closed her eyes for just a moment and placed her hands on the keyboard knot. Trembling now, but steady. She did not see the audience anymore. She did not hear the whispers. All she heard was memory, her father's voice, low and loving, humming along with her during childhood practice sessions. The smell of old wood and ink-stained sheet music. Feeling of small fingers struggling through scales that eventually became fluid. She had lived this piece. Even when she had not touched a piano in years, it had lived inside her. She opened her eyes and began. The first notes were quiet, gentle, like the beginning of a story, only she knew how to tell. The sound curled through the concert hall and wrapped around the room like smoke. It was not perfect in the mechanical sense. It was better. It was alive. Pierce's expression faltered completely. What had begun as amusement turned to confusion, then disbelief, because what he heard was not a timid attempt. It was not a parlor trick or a lucky guess. It was mastery, real undeniable mastery. Each passage grew in intensity. Hadley's fingers moved with fluid control, her body shifting slightly as she leaned into the heart of the piece. It was as if she were unlocking the piano's soul, one phrase at a time. The tempo changes, the flourishes, the deep emotional swells, they were all there. Not copied from a recording, but understood, felt, lived. The audience sat stunned. No one moved. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. The ushers forgot he was supposed to be standing. Even Mrs. Henderson, the prominent donor in the front, leaned so far forward in her seat it looked like she might fall. It was more than music. It was revelation. Hadley's expression stayed calm, focused, yet her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The notes moved through her, not from her. Her shoulders rose and fell with every emotional peak. When the piece reached its first dramatic high, the sound that burst from the piano was nothing short of breathtaking. It was not show, it was personal, and the realization swept through the room like a chill. This woman was not pretending to be a pianist. She was one. Pierce remained, frozen in place, arms still crossed, but his fingers were curled tightly against his jacket sleeves. He could not believe what he was hearing. Every line of melody, every tempo shift, every interpretation, perfect, and not just in the way that echoed recordings or tradition. She was doing things he had never considered. She was discovering truths in the music he had never seen, and she was doing it on his stage, on his piano, in front of his audience. As the music continued, the air in the room changed. There was no more condescension, no more polite smirks. No, just stunned silence. And in that silence, Hadley played on not to prove a point, but because this was the only place she had ever truly belonged. The storm inside the piano began to swell. Hadley moved into the heart of the ballade now. The section that crushed even seasoned performers, the cascading runs, the sudden shifts in mood, the fierce technical demands that had reduced many students to tears. But there was no fear in her fingers, only freedom. Her hands flew over the keys like they had done it 1,000 times in private. Because they had to her, this moment was not a surprise. It was a return to the music she had buried years ago, a return to herself. The audience could feel it. Every phrase she played seemed to pull something from them they had forgotten. They still carried longing, regret, wonder, hope, emotions wrapped inside, notes that floated through the hall with aching clarity. There was no flash in her performance, no ego. It was raw, honest. Intimate people began leaning forward without realizing it. One man wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. A young girl in the back, who had come with her mother and knew nothing about Chopin, found herself holding her breath. Even Mrs. Henderson had lowered her opera glasses and clutched them in both hands, her lips slightly parted. The entire hall had fallen into reverence and still. Pierce stood by, stunned. This was not supposed to happen. He had spent his life perfecting this craft. He had studied in Paris, performed in Vienna, played under gold domes and before kings. But now he was watching something that no masterclass could have prepared him for a simple woman. With no platform, no reputation, no history, making the piano sing in a way he never had. He searched for flaws. He waited for the telltale stumble of an amateur, but there were none. And worse, her interpretation was different. Not just accurate, deeper. She heard things in the music that he had missed. She brought out harmonies that felt like secrets being told for the first time. She played with humility, but also with power, the quiet kind that came from surviving. She was not just playing the ballade, she was living it. And as the middle section thundered forward, she did not back down. The most complex run burst forth from the keys, and her fingers chased it with grace and precision, her body rising and falling with the rhythm like a wave meeting shore. It was not mechanical brilliance. It was emotional release. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She made no effort to stop them. They were not a sign of weakness. They were part of the piece. Hadley had always believed the ballade was not about perfection. It was about remembering something you had lost and daring to find it again. And now, the audience understood that too. The room was still in awe when she reached the climactic section, a soaring eruption of passion and grief, a lifetime into less than a minute of music. Her hands blurred. The notes collided like fire and rain. Her entire being moved with the melody, every gesture infused with meaning, not drama. The crescendo hit like a confession, and then came the descent, the final stretch of aching beauty, where each note seemed to ask a question only silence could answer. When her fingers reached the last chord, she held it with gentle insistence, letting it ring, letting it breathe. Then silence. Not applause, not gasps, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like the world has stopped turning for a moment, waiting to see what happens next. Hadley sat still at the bench, her head bowed slightly, her hands resting gently in her lap. The tears on her face glistened, but she made no movement to wipe them. She had not played to impress. She had played because something inside her had begged for release. Pierce could not move. He looked out at the audience, saw the tears, the stunned expressions. The people who had come for him but were now looking at her as if they had just witnessed something sacred. He turned back to Hadley. This was not what he had expected. He had tried to humiliate her, to remind her of her place, but instead, she had reminded everyone, including him, of something he had forgotten, what it meant to feel, what it meant to truly make music. And for the first time in a very long time, Pierce Whitmore did not know what to do next. The hall remained frozen, suspended in the echo of that final chord. No one dared move. It was as though the entire audience had been holding its collective breath, and now no one remembered how to exhale then. Quietly from the front row, Mrs. Henderson stood. Her hands came together, slowly at first clap, clap, and then with growing strength. Applause broke out like sunlight through a storm. Others rose to their feet, drawn not by social custom, but by something far deeper, reverence. They were not applauding a novelty. They were acknowledging greatness. One by one, the entire audience stood in ovation. Not a soul remained seated. The thunder of their appreciation swelled through the marble walls. Reaching every corner of the hall, Hadley sat still for a moment. Longer, eyes glistening, heart racing. This had never been her dream, not exactly. She had not dared to dream this far. She'd only wanted to feel the music again, to honor the memory of her father, to prove to herself, maybe, that it had not all been lost. But this was something else. She slowly rose from the piano bench, unsure whether to bow or run. The applause kept building, not just from the donors and the dignitaries, but from the ushers and the back row guests, and the lighting tech in the balcony, who had watched hundreds of recitals and never once cried. Till now and then, the noise. Pierce began to move. He took slow, measured steps toward the piano. The same man who had stood there moments earlier with folded arms and sharp condescension now looked like someone seeing clearly for the first time. He reached her side and opened his mouth, but the words caught. That had never happened to him before. Finally, he said, his voice low but steady. That was. He stopped again, visibly struggling to find the language. The man who had always spoken with certainty, who had dazzled audiences with his introductions and interviews, was speechless. Hadley looked at him gently, her expression not triumphant, but open, forgiving. Pierce tried again. How long have you been playing? Since I was 7, she said softly. He taught me. We had an old, upright piano. We could not afford lessons for both of us, so we shared the bench. Pierce nodded slowly, something unspoken softening in his face. He must have been extraordinary. Hadley's smile was small, but bright. He was. The crowd began to settle, sensing something personal unfolding. Pierce lowered his voice and leaned slightly toward her. I owe you an apology, he said. What I did tonight, calling you out like that, was not just rude, it was cruel. Hadley shook her head, not in dismissal, but in calm understanding. You do not owe me anything, she replied. Music does not belong to you, or me. It belongs to whoever needs it. The words hit him harder than he expected. For years, Pierce had thought of music as something to conquer, to dominate, to master. But in her words, he heard something else, something truer. A reminder that music was not about status, it was about soul. He turned back to the audience and raised his hand, calling for quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice still a little uneven, you came here tonight expecting me to play for you, but what you just witnessed was something far more important than anything I had planned. He gestured to Hadley. This woman, someone many of you would not have noticed if she walked past you in the hallway, just gave us all a gift that most musicians spend their lives chasing: honesty, vulnerability, truth. He looked at her, and this time there was no trace of ego. Would you consider continuing the recital? Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by murmurs of approval. Mrs. Henderson called out first, Yes, dear, please. Most beautiful performance I have ever heard. Others echoed her. Applause rose again, not just as appreciation, but as encouragement. Hadley looked out at them all, overwhelmed. I do not know if I could, she stammered. You do not need to be used to it, Pierce interrupted gently. You belong here. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her the bench again not as a test, but as a gift. For the first time, he meant it. Hadley looked at the keys. Her fingers twitched at the thought. And then she thought of her father again, of the nights when he would sit beside her, humming the tune of a nocturne they both loved, the one piece that always gave her comfort. She turned to the audience, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maybe just one more. The room quieted, and once more Hadley sat at the piano. But this time, there was no fear in her movement, only peace. 6 months later, the same grand concert hall glowed under its chandeliers, just as it had that unforgettable night. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, the air scented faintly with fresh-cut lilies. Elegant guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits. But something about the energy in the room was different this time, warmer, less rigid. The buzz in the air wasn't about a famous name. Turning it was about a name the world had only just begun to discover. Printed on the glossy programs in elegant script were the words, Hadley Morrison, piano. Her photograph graced the poster. Outside the venue, framed in soft light, her expression serene. Gone was the gray skirt and cleaning badge. Tonight, she wore a simple midnight blue gown that flowed around her like water, her blonde hair gathered at the nape of her neck in a soft twist, still modest, still understated, but now, unmistakably seen. Pierce stood beside her in the hallway. Just off stage, adjusting his tie not as performer, but as page-turner, he had insisted really, on serving her tonight. She had tried to protest. He had simply smiled and said, Let me show you what real humility looks like. The man who had once been her tormentor had become her champion, his foundation. Launched quietly a month after that fateful evening, now sought out overlooked talent across the country. He had held press conferences and interviews not about himself, but about her. Hadley reminded me why I became a musician, he had told one magazine, and more importantly what I forgot along the way. Mrs. Henderson, seated in the front row again, wore a beaming smile and carried a small bouquet of gardenias to present afterward. She had started funding music scholarships for underprivileged youth. Used to look at people and only see roles, she had said once. Now I look for stories. The lights dimmed. Backstage, Pierce looked at Hadley. Nervous? She nodded, exhaling slowly. Terrified? He smiled. Good. That means it still matters. Hadley stepped onto the stage, and the crowd erupted. Into applause, not polite, not automatic, but full of affection and respect. ... She paused beside the piano, bowing gently, before taking her seat at the bench. She ran her fingers once over the smooth keys, grounding herself, and then she began. Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Once more. This time it was different. She was not playing to prove anything. She was not playing through fear. She was playing in celebration. Of her father, whose voice still echoed in her mind. Oh, every hour spent practicing in that tiny apartment. Of every moment she had felt invisible and unheard. Second chances. Her touch was confident, expressive, radiant. The music poured out not just from her fingers, but from a well of emotion that reached every heart in the room. Pierce stood just to her side, turning pages silently, reverently, watching her hands move like poetry. At times, he forgot to breathe. Because in that moment, he knew exactly what he was witnessing. Not competition. Not redemption. Transformation. As the final notes rang out once again, soft and haunting, the audience rose to their feet. Tears streamed down faces. Strangers held hands. Somewhere in the back, a teenage boy who had never cared for classical music leaned forward, changed. And this time, when they clapped, it was not just for what she had played, it was for what she had become. After the performance, as the crowd lingered and press photographers swarmed discreetly, Hadley walked slowly through the hallway, her satin shoes gliding across the marble. She stopped near the old service door, the same one she used to enter unnoticed, carrying rags and polish. She looked at it for a long time, then smiled. She turned to Pierce, who had joined her quietly. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "I should be thanking you. You gave all of us something we forgot we needed." As the two of them stood there, student and teacher, challenger and believer, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that went beyond music, went beyond apology. It was about truth, a truth that had lived inside her all along, waiting for the world to be ready, and now it was. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The city moved on as it always had, unaware that inside a concert hall, something extraordinary had just happened. Not just a performance, but a reminder that sometimes the most powerful music comes from the most unexpected places, played by hands that have scrubbed the very floor they now stand upon, by hearts that have carried both grief and grace, and by voices the world almost failed to hear. And if we are lucky, if we are quiet, we will notice the Hadleys in our own lives, and we will listen.